We're at the Detroit Historical Museum talking about the summer of '67 and how what happened 50 years ago still shapes the city of Detroit and Southeast Michigan today. Stay with us. My Week starts right now.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made in Merillat cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929. Funding for this program is provided by Delta Airlines. Keep climbing.
Hi there and welcome to My Week. I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for joining us. We're at the Detroit Historical Museum for a special show devoted to what happened 50 years ago in the summer of 1967. Our coverage coincides with the opening this weekend of an exhibit here at the museum called Detroit '67 Perspectives. We're not just looking back, but we're taking a hard look at where we are now and where we can be 50 years from now when it comes to how we think about race, opportunity, education, and policing in Southeast Michigan. It is a full show with stories from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and its project over the last year called The Intersection. But let's start first with our My Week contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Hi, guys. It's always good to see you.
Good to see you.
You know, we were upstairs looking at the exhibit, the three of us were, and I think it's very interesting that how the exhibit starts with definitions, you know, and the phrase of really what's in a name, and we've heard it called the Riot of '67, the uprising, the rebellion. Why is it so important to define those words, or maybe have people have definitions of different definitions of what actually happened back in '67? We'll start with you, Nolan.
Well, you know, I started at the Detroit News 9 years after '67, and you know, the riot was what it was called, so that's what I've always called it. It became a matter of habit. People in the black community see it from a different perspective. The word's very important to them in terms of defining what this event was and what it, not necessarily what it was, but what it meant and what it signified. So,
what do you think it should be called?
I think you have to, well, I think there's no question it was a rebellion when it started. It was a rebellion against the police brutality that we saw happening against African Americans in the city for a really long time, not just in 1967. It developed into a riot, though, which was clear on 12th Street and Dexter and all these other places where people were, you know, smashing up businesses. Some of them, in some cases, black-owned businesses suffered as well. I think the definition is important because it helps you put it in historical context. It helps you understand that this was not just an event that happened over a few days, but that this was something that culminated after years and decades of behavior, and it helps us understand how that casts forward 50 years to now.
You know, I also think it's interesting, too, in figuring out how to cover an anniversary of an event like this and how you have to tread and what kind of conversations that you need to have surrounding this, Nolan.
well, they've done a very good job here, I think, of defining the event and its impact. But more importantly, why we're still talking about it 50 years later. I'd be curious to go to the other cities who are marking 50 years of disturbances this summer, because remember, that was a summer filled, those 2 years, 67 and 68, of disturbances in major cities across America. And I wonder if in other places that event was as seminal as it has been in Detroit. It's dominated the conversation during my whole time here. And I would say we haven't stopped talking about it in 50 years. It was that significant to this city and its future.
Its significance in looking back, but also looking at where we are now. But Stephen, what are the pitfalls, or what do you have to take in consideration when you cover something like this and looking at 50 years?
Well, I think the importance, again, is to put it into context and to say, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's what we're dealing with now, and here's why we're in that situation. Part of it is, after this ends, we don't deal with the things that caused it. There is no real reckoning with the issue of police brutality for another 6 years, even in the public square. It's still an issue we see around the country today. The deep poverty, the isolation, the disinvestment, those are things that stayed with us a long time after the riots or the rebellion or whatever you want to call it. I think now it's really important to try to pull those narratives out of it, to be able to talk about what the opportunity is going forward.
And it wasn't like it was some great learning experience, some great change. Stress that was so divisive in this town and so hard on the community. That came after the riots.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to look at some of the recommendations that came out of it 50 years ago and kind of compare where we are today. And to give you a little bit of perspective looking back, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative set out to examine the findings that came out of the uprising of '67. The DJC is made up of 6 media groups who have joined together to report on Detroit's story. It's us here at Detroit Public TV, also Michigan Radio, WDET, New Michigan Media, Bridge Magazine, and Chalkbeat Detroit. Take a look.
We said it couldn't happen, but it did, and the nation was shocked.
The summer of 1967 saw dozens of uprisings in urban centers across the nation. Detroit's was the worst.
I do hereby officially request the immediate deployment of federal troops into Michigan to assist state and local authorities in reestablishing law and order in the city of Detroit.
43 people were killed, most of them black. More than 1,000 other people were injured. 2,500 stores were looted or burned. Nearly 400 families lost their homes.
It was just a burst of fire from the top of the building.
Before the fires in Detroit were out, President Lyndon Johnson appointed an 11-member Special Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder, known as the Kerner Commission. That commission ultimately blamed the violent outbreaks on federal and state governments ignoring the plight of black residents, on white attitudes toward blacks, and on mainstream media for ignoring the problems and consistently presenting only the white point of view. The report's most quoted conclusion read, "Our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal."
This is a battle zone. These are troops. It's like war.
Nearly 5 decades later, the Kerner Report is still considered one of the most insightful documents on race relations and remedies for discrimination to ever be published by the government. It became a best-selling paperback, yet it was largely ignored by President Johnson and Congress. By some measures, black residents in Detroit are in worse shape now than black residents were during the civil rights struggles in the 1960s. Nathaniel Jones served as an assistant counsel on the commission and believes the Kerner Report remains an important way forward.
The answers are found in that document, and I think we need to focus as much as we can people's attention on what the findings of that commission were, what the conditions were at the time it was organized and created, and the recommendations that it came up with.
All right, and joining us now in the discussion are a couple of our partners in the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, Chastity Pratt-Dawsey from Bridge Magazine and Keith Owens, the senior editor of the Michigan Chronicle. It's good to see both of you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, let me just get started in talking about when the DJC said, all right, we're going to take on this project of the intersection and take a look at the Kerner Commission report and pull out some items. Chastity, describe what some of those conversations were about how we were going to actually start to tackle that.
Oh, it was a lot of voices saying a lot of things all at once. And the Kerner Commission report gave us something to frame the discussion, because we all are familiar with its recommendations and the fact that a lot of those recommendations were never implemented. And it gave us something to just shape our stories around, and to some data points. You know, let's compare then to now. It was going to be more than just saying, oh, things were bad then and they're bad now. It really gave us several different issues to tackle, to collect data on, and make the comparisons around.
And Keith, what were some of those key issues?
Well, housing was one, of course. You know, education. We're talking about was as well known back at that time. Redlining was a severe issue in Detroit, and comparing that to now, what is the situation now? Of course, education. Chassie did a lot on that. But I would say those, and race. Obviously, that's one of the main issues that was raised by the Kerner Commission report. Two communities, one white, one black, separate and unequal. So looking in terms of how Detroit is really, of course, Detroit was not the only city in America that's experienced racism, but of course it was viewed as one of the key, because particularly with the advent of the rebellion, riot, in terms of what that meant. And so we examined that in terms of what race meant then, what it means now, how it defined Detroit, and how it continues to define Detroit.
One thing I really want to talk about also is policing, and you guys talked about it a little bit before we went into that piece, and where we are now, and in terms of how the community is reacting with police. And Stephen, I'm going to start with you, and how do you think that we have come so far?
I think there's no question that in Detroit, this is a much different issue today than it was 50 years ago. It's actually a much different issue than it was 15 or 20 years ago, when you saw the Free Press unveil a series that talked about, dragnet investigations, coercing witnesses. I mean, really awful kinds of behavior. We've come a long way in Detroit, and that's not to say there aren't still issues between police and communities, particularly communities of color in the city, but I think in general it's fair to say that the police work with the community here in a way that other cities could learn from and sort of make progress.
And how do departments though build that kind of trust?
Well, I think James Craig is a particularly fine example of how it works. He's been very mindful of being in the community, of explaining things to the community, of trying to get out ahead of potential sparks. But there are still some things we ought to be worried about. If you look at the classes coming into the police academy, they still don't look like the city's population. They're heavily white still, and I think you have to always keep in mind the problems. Problem 67, there were very few black officers, and I think the makeup of the police department does matter, and they have to pay some attention to that.
Chastity?
I was just going to say the same thing. You had 5% of the police force that was black back in 1967, and it's way different today. And even though the city is majority black, they do see black officers far more often, and that makes a difference. And also, you got to remember, we were under federal oversight for a while, so that cleaned up a lot of the problems that happened within the police force here in Detroit.
Keith, what do you think?
Well, I think, one of the stories we did actually, when you're looking at when I spoke with some of the police who were police officers back at that time, a woman who was the first deputy police chief Coleman Young appointed. And one of the things, when she talked about the experiences that she had working on the desk at night and hearing the white police officers come in and talking about how they had just cracked black kids and laughing at it in front of her, making a point that make sure that she heard that. So I think that at that time there was a sense the police was an occupying army. It was not a part of the community, it was never intended to be. But now I think there's not, like I said, once again, we're not where we need to be, but we're definitely not at that position now, so it's definitely made some progress.
All right, I want to take a look now at where we are today when it comes to perceptions of institutional racism. Professor Peter Hammer is the director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Justice at Wayne State University. Take a look.
We're at ground zero of structural racism or spatial racism in Southeast Michigan. And sometimes I say we're the new Selma. And if we don't recognize that, and if we don't rally to that and call things by their true names. So it's incredibly disturbing to me as people are talking about this renaissance of Detroit, this sort of restructuring of Detroit, the resurrection of Detroit. You look at the major documents that underlying that, going back to Detroit Future City, looking at the Blight Removal Task Force report, looking at the Bankruptcy Plan of Adjustment, those are completely acontextual. They are looking at the issues and challenges of Detroit economically in complete isolation from our history. Right? And anybody who knows anything says if you don't do a root cause analysis, if you're not addressing the root causes, there's no chance to have a success. And then people sort of throw up their hands in their surprise that there's a tale of two cities emerging, that in 7.2 miles of the city where tremendous investment is going on, largely public subsidized, right? So it's Detroit dollars that are actually increasing the economic divides. And then you go out to the neighborhoods and you look at the state of the schools, and that's largely a failure of state policy, right? The problems in Detroit public schools are decades-long problems in the school finance formulas, compounded by the lifting of the sort of cap on charter schools, and you have had generations of Detroit children that are basically been written off through no fault of their own. right, through a failure of state policy. So all of these things are coalescing in Detroit in ways that are more serious than probably any other part of the country.
You know, I think it's very interesting to hear him say that. And also, so we're talking about jobs here, we're talking about economic opportunity, we're also talking about education and housing, Keith. And what stuck out to you most of all in that conversation with him?
Well, I think what stuck most is, once again, in terms of housing, you know, in terms of the segregation that's there. When we're talking about the children that have been locked out, you know, I think that's the thing that jumps out at you, because we're talking about an education system that has still failed. Of course, Chastity's done a lot about that, but what that means for the future of the city, you know, in terms of when you're talking about the economic, the opportunities that are here, but will they be able to take advantage of those that are here? And are they sufficiently prepared for that? And that's what we need. I mean, we talk about a lot of research into the city, which is great. But when we're talking about we failed a generation of children who have not been given the tools that they need to succeed in the Detroit that's moving, you know, in a whole new direction. And a lot of the jobs that are coming are not there. That really holds some serious questions for the future of the city. Yeah, Chastity, you've done a lot of reporting on education and taking a look at where we were 50 years ago and now in Detroit schools. And how do you compare?
What we see is, you know, schools are more segregated now, 50 years later, than they were in 1967. I mean, it's just bad. And in the entering suburbs, in the city, you have far more schools that are majority black and majority white. And you have people that keep moving out by choice and kind of perpetuating the cycle. Since 1967, you had the Milliken, the Bradley versus Milliken desegregation case, where the U.S. Supreme Court basically made it easy to keep segregated schools in our region. And after that, you had school choice, which allowed people to stay where they were and exacerbate segregation as well. So the schools are more segregated, and you have an imbalance of resources going to schools. You have poorer, browner, blacker schools getting less resources, and that's why I say we're worse off now than we were in 1967 as far as education. I mean, that's a stunning thing to hear, Nolan. And how is that impacting where we are today?
Well, I mean, if we don't get education right, I think Chastity is right on. We're not going up. We've been going down over these past 50 years. We don't get education right, you're at risk of establishing a permanent underclass in this society, and that's not good for a lot of reasons, but it's also not good for the economy, just sheer economic reasons. That's a bad thing. And so we've got to get people trained to work. We have to provide opportunities for entrepreneurship across the board, for African Americans, for others. You've got to have full participation in the economy. I think economic empowerment solves a lot of ills.
Stephen.
So I think you got to pull the lens back a little bit and look at how we're doing this. Think of how we prioritize education in the city versus other things. Think of this week, for instance. How easy was it for the Pistons to get $35 million in subsidy to move downtown? How easy is it to fill a hole by contrast in the school budget? And I understand that there's laws and there's processes that set that up, but those are the things we need to be looking at. Why do we make it easier for a basketball team to get $34 million than for a school to have enough money to serve 3 meals a day, for instance, which you need to do in a lot of schools, or to keep the heat on in the winter? We're getting that wrong, and I think we got to start talking about it at that level.
That's why it's being challenged. I mean, that's extremely important, and I think that's why that's actually being challenged by a couple people now. I think which that challenge actually has some merit. I mean, in terms of, because that's what a lot of Detroiters are asking themselves. I mean, all the policy and everything else aside, I think your average Detroiter is wondering, how in the world is all this being built so quickly, so fast, and when they want money, they can get it. But then we can't get it, and I think that people are worried about
Keith,
this.
what will the Pistons pay its first round draft pick today? Today's the draft. What will that contract be?
Yeah.
just one would.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Right,
half
right.
the school budget.
And yet, you know, we keep having these sport teams come up and saying, we need public dollars. And I don't care if it's the Pistons or the Tigers or whomever. If you can pay a shortstop who's, you know, batting 220 and not playing $25–30 million a year, why do you need that out of the city budget?
A little bit of priority.
When you take a longer view, like Stephen was saying, you also have to say, if our schools are failing, what happens? What other dominoes fall? You have a joblessness rate, an unemployment rate that is worse in the city than it was 50 years ago. You have people who are black and brown not getting the opportunities that they were used to 50 years ago. Just, you know, a few years past Jim Crow, things are worse off as far as joblessness, housing, schools, all of that. And then you got a prison population. 7,000 people were in prison in 1967. Now we got 41,000, and most of those people are uneducated people who are black and brown, and very many from Detroit.
Yeah, the mass incarceration problem is definitely a big one. I want to end, Keith, with you with housing, and Chastity brought it up. Where are we today? And when we compare the availability of housing, the ease of being able to own your own home here in the city of Detroit?
Well, I think it's interesting because the way it's being promoted is that, move to Detroit, get a cheap house. This is a great place to buy. The reality is not there. And when you're looking at the average, most homes are sold now. As I said before, there was a great piece done in Cranes where they had most homes being sold cash, about $30,000, very few being able to get mortgage. Most of the homes are underwater now, so people who want to sell their homes really can't do it, especially if they want to get a profit. People want to buy a house, can't get a loan to do it. So, it's a much more complex situation because the economy in Detroit is still shot. It's still not good. So that causes a number of problems, and just and that's for anybody. Even people with great credit are having problems with that. So you look at the average Detroiter who has very little money, poor, and also more people are renting now. It used to be the place where most African Americans own their home.
That's no longer first time since the 50s, yeah.
Right. No, that's turned. So that's no longer the case. So it's a bad situation.
Well, we'll continue to watch what you both write in Michigan Chronicle and also in Bridge Magazine as we continue to do our project with the DJC. Keith Owens and Chastity Pratt-Dawsey, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. Finally, how do we talk about race in this region? Can we find common ground, and can perceptions be changed? Take a look.
You have some young people who have the mindset that I'm not going to just sit up here and let you put the billy club upside my head. You're not going to sit up here and just tase me for no apparent reason. And, you're not going to just sit up here and continuously shoot us without some type of repercussion. So everything reaches a boiling point.
I think people are still in this idea that it's black people's fault that Detroit is the way it is. And only through reinvesting in certain industries that are run by a small cadre of people is how we're going to get to the Detroit that they think they remember.
The majority of African American cities in this state have been under some kind of what I consider reptilian law called emergency management that has extracted from them not only their voting rights, but their property, their pensions, control over their schools.
If you want people to achieve equality, then you need to take care of the neighborhoods, and you need to give some hope. And hope in the neighborhoods come in two things: blight and crime. If you will not clean up the neighborhoods, if you will not have proper police presence, there won't be neighborhood pride, and therefore that affects the people in the neighborhood.
A couple of different perspectives there, and I guess I'm going to ask the largest question. Have we graduated to a place here in Southeast Michigan where we are having good conversations about race, or are people still afraid to talk about it? I'm going to start with you, Stephen.
People are definitely afraid to talk about it. People are uncomfortable with it. We saw on Mackinac Island just a few weeks ago, Mayor Mike Duggan stand up and try to put some of the things that he faces on a daily basis in historical context and talk about race and racism. If you looked around that auditorium,
people were very surprised too.
People were uncomfortable, and I think that's actually okay. We need to be uncomfortable for a little bit while we sort of shake things up and say, we do have to address these things. We do have to think about them. That's the only way we get to the place where people are comfortable enough to start thinking about it in terms of how you push back against it. How do you reframe some of these issues so that race plays less of a role than it does now?
What do you think, Nolan?
Well, yes, conversation's important, but action, attitude's important too. And I will say, so we perhaps finish on a positive note. This is the first time in my 40 years where you have people outside the city in Michigan rooting for the city. Most of my time here, there was a real animosity between suburbs and city, between state and city. And I think that's breaking down as people become more involved in the city, as their children move here, as their attitudes change about the importance of Detroit. And I think that's a very helpful, useful step that could lead to some long-term positive change.
Yeah, and I really think, and I hope that this exhibit here at the Detroit Historical Museum sparks a lot of that conversation. Being able to go through and take a look at things that led up to 67, and then things that came out of it. It's a very thoughtful way to put it all into context, Stephen.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think they did a good job here of focusing people not just on what happened, but again, that broader context, this long run-up to these events that took place in this city, and of course the long run after that, where we've not come to reckon with all of those things in a way that would change them.
Yeah, and continues to shape where we are today. All right, thanks guys so much. That is going to do it for MiWeek. Head to MiWeek.org. We'll have a link to all of the work from the Detroit Journalism Cooperative over the past year on the intersection. Plus, you can come to the Detroit Historical Museum starting Saturday, June 24th for the interactive exhibit, Detroit 67 Perspectives. Our thanks to the museum for having us here. I'm Christy McDonald. We will see you next time for MiWeek. Take care.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Masco Corporation is proud to manufacture innovative and environmentally friendly products for the home. Delta faucets, craft-made and Merilite cabinets, and Behr brand paints have all been designed with you in mind. Masco and its family of companies, serving Michigan communities since 1929. Funding for this program is provided by Delta Airlines. Keep climbing.